Welcome everyone to today's webinar titled Extending Zero Trust to the Endpoint. Today's webinar will be recorded and available after the webinar session is over. All lines will be muted throughout today's presentation, so if you have any questions, please submit them through the questions box, and our presenters will answer them at the end of our webinar. Today our presenters will be John Kindervag, the creator of the Zero Trust model, former Forrester analyst, and current field CTO at Palo Alto Networks, and Lieuwe Koning, CTO at ON2IT. John, I'll turn it over to you to kick us off.
Hey, thanks so much, Andrew, and welcome everybody. We're excited to be here. We're going to be talking to you about how you take your Zero Trust networks and you use our traps and global protect products to extend Zero Trust all the way to the endpoint. And I'm joined by Lieuwe Jan Koning, the CTO of ON2IT out of the Netherlands, a very good friend of mine, one of the guys who's been working with me on Zero Trust from the beginning, and a real expert here. Welcome, Lieuwe.
Thank you, John. Hi, everyone.
So today what I'm going to be talking to you about is some of these architectural elements, and then Lieuwe's going to show you some of the things that he does with his clients to actually accomplish this. So I'll explain at the beginning a little bit what is Zero Trust. Hopefully you've heard about it, and if you haven't, we have a lot more resources for you. Then I'll talk about why endpoint security is most effective when it's integrated with network security. This is a key point that I think a lot of people don't yet understand. And then we'll talk about how the platform that does the integration has to be data-centric, and we must follow the data and protect it everywhere as it moves, as it's used. This is really a data story. We'll talk about the Layer 2 access control and inspection that has to go all the way through Layer 7. So this is a big story of talking Layer 2 through Layer 7 in Zero Trust, and not just focusing at lower layers of the stack where we don't have as much visibility into what's happening. And then I'll turn it over to Lieuwe, and he'll talk about what he's doing specifically. So what is Zero Trust? Well, very simply, Zero Trust is the idea that trust is a vulnerability and we need to eliminate it. And the best way that I've found to explain what we're doing architecturally is show how the U.S. Secret Service does executive protection. This is a slide from President Obama's 2012 inaugural parade, and he is in the limousine at the bottom of the screen known as the Beast. And so the Secret Service, when they're doing executive protection, they don't necessarily focus only on the old style things. They focus on the details. They focus on who the president is. It's presidential centric. And so you need to think about what you're trying to protect, the data, the assets, and then where is that located? They know where the president is. And then finally, who should have access to the president? These are the three questions that the Secret Service asks when they're doing executive protection, and these are the three questions you should ask when you're designing your security. So the old school way of thinking about security is to have a perimeter. And you can see there's still a perimeter here when they're doing executive protection, but it's fairly gappy. And if you notice, if you can look on your screen, you'll see that all those uniformed U.S. Secret Service agents have their hands in their pockets. They're not anticipating a problem. That's not where the real security should, they're thinking about it. So what they've done is they've defined a protect surface. Now, a protect surface is the subset of the attack surface that's manageable. So a protect surface is always orders of magnitude smaller than the overall attack surface, and it's knowable. And so the protect surface in this case is the President of the United States. In your case, it's going to be the data or the assets or the services that you're trying to protect. And by defining a protect surface, this allows you to do something quite remarkable, which is move your controls as close as possible to the protect surface. This is what they're doing with the U.S. Secret Service, and by doing this, it automatically creates a micro-perimeter around the protect surface. That micro-perimeter is enforced by policy. That policy has been given to each of the controls, the U.S. Secret Service agents, prior to the beginning of this parade. So they know exactly how they're going to respond. But what if there's a change? What if something happens and they need to make a change? Well, one of the key components is monitoring. They're constantly monitoring and updating everything. And they're able to push policy in real time down to the controls of the Secret Service agents through those microphones that you've seen in the movies. They talk to them, it looks like, through their wrists, and then they have earpieces where they get the new policy. That is exactly what you should be doing. And so this is a zero trust method of doing executive protection, and this is a good visual representation of what you should do, how you should start your zero trust journey in your network. But we need to actually extend that security all the way out to the endpoint now. Think of it as putting a Secret Service agent right next to everybody in the audience. That's what we're going to be talking about today. How do we extend that? How do we leverage what we can do? And so in order to make this happen, we have to extend the endpoint via the network. So the endpoint must become part of the network. And endpoint security is therefore most effective by orders of magnitude, I would suggest, when it's integrated with network security. So this is our platform. This is the Palo Alto Networks platform, and in the bottom right, it's the network security products, what we're most known for. We invented the next generation firewall and still lead in that space, again, by a tremendous amount. But we have another set of technologies that are all integrated. So we have advanced endpoint protection, cloud security products, and then all those things integrate through our cloud delivered security services to create an integrated platform. And so today what we're going to be talking about is taking that next generation firewall network security technology and adding Traps, our advanced endpoint security agent, and Global Protect, our VPN and policy management solution, and bringing them all together into a single unified vision so that endpoint security and network security are joined together with each other for zero trust. Now, Lieuwe, you've been doing zero trust for a long time, and I know that you don't have any other endpoint products in your portfolio other than ours. Tell me about how you perceive the platform and why you chose Traps as your endpoint security product.
Yes, well, that's actually very simple. It's not really about the endpoint product that's unique. Well, it's of course an important part of it, but it's actually the platform that is key here. In my view, you should always inspect the network traffic of everything, as we know from the zero trust concept, but also from endpoint. So endpoint, we need to see the command and control traffic that it might send out and see what kind of malicious URLs it tries to visit. And you're not going to do that on the endpoint alone. It's always a symbiosis of what we can see on the network and what we can see on the endpoint. So those two, to marry those two together, that's crucial to me. And well, you need a platform for this with different features of the platform. That's how I see it. Traps is a feature of the security platform of Palo Alto, because we need both.
So when, as a reseller, right, you had your choice of all the various endpoint agents, all the traditional antivirus and things like that. Why didn't you ever resell any of those? What changed your mind about the endpoint with Traps?
Well, we took a look at lots of them, basically because they don't work. I want to have a very lightweight solution on the endpoint. Endpoint protection used to be cumbersome. It used to be annoyance. It would slow down your system. And Traps was the first time I was actually happy with the results. It would really block my zero-day malware from day one. It's really preventing infections from spreading, from happening, without crippling my system completely. So at that time it was a game changer for me, and finally we dared to go into that direction. And I'll get into that later in the webinar again to show them in a little more technical detail.
So for those of you who aren't very familiar with our Traps endpoint security solution and our Global Protect, let me just give you a quick overview. Traps is advanced endpoint protection. It does some amazing things. The primary thing it does is it inverted the way we do endpoint security by blocking malware, exploits, and ransomware. And one of the key things here is while there may be, probably an unlimited or a infinite number of potential malware pieces out there, there's only a small amount of exploits that can actually be executed on any particular endpoint operating system. And that's what Traps focused on, and that was the big game changer. So I constantly hear from people who they had ransomware stopped by Traps, and it just was stopped. There were no other forensic things anybody had to do. They just got an alert, oh, we stopped this ransomware. And it happens all the time, and I've got clients who have multiple different endpoints because they believe in the old notion of defense in depth, but yet a lot of times those pieces of malware get through traditional endpoint security and they're blocked by Traps. So blocking and prevention are the most important things that Traps does. And then it coordinates the enforcement with the network and the cloud. So it brings everything together. Everything shares telemetry and data and alerts. And then by doing that, we can detect threats and automate containment and send that information to everybody who subscribes to the cloud-based services so that we're protecting our entire client base all at the same time. And all these things accelerate our response when we're doing endpoint security. Now, Traps has a multi-method malware prevention capability, and I think it's important to understand that at a very high level. It ingests a tremendous amount of threat intelligence. We, through our cloud, starting with Wildfire and other things that we've created, have the world's largest of privately available threat intelligence and malware samples and all kinds of security information. So all that stuff is digested and coordinated. And then as things hit the endpoint agent, and I use this on my own machine, so I'm very familiar with it, it does local analysis, which helps to prevent unknown threats. And then it has dynamic analysis, which looks for advanced unknown threats, the things that don't have any kind of signature but are really, really advanced. And then it also looks at malicious processes and can prevent those. And it has additional ransomware protection, which is huge. So all those things work together to really solve a fundamental problem. Because I believe, and we believe at the company, but I believe personally, that blocking exploitation techniques is the most effective approach. If you're doing patching, right, that just is really hard. It's a hard, scalable problem. If you're doing signature and behavior-based things, it requires a lot of prior knowledge around the exploits that are going to happen. But if you focus on exploit prevention, it doesn't require patching. It doesn't require prior knowledge of vulnerabilities. It doesn't require signatures. It's just, it changes the calculus of endpoint security, and I wish more people really understood that value, and hopefully this will cause you to take a look at what we're really doing here. And then we have Global Protect and Global Protect Cloud Services. This is ostensibly our VPN solution, but it's policy-based VPNs. And so, of course, as you're in a network, the user base goes through and is controlled by the next generation firewall, URL filtering, and access control policy and threat prevention and sandboxing, all that kind of stuff happens there. But by using Global Protect, you can connect all of your managed endpoints and things that will come back through your network directly with that same kind of policy. And now we offer what's called Global Protect as a service. So Global Protect as a service is where we've put our technology into a cloud, and it's a cloud-based service, and you connect through it, you manage the policy, but we maintain the technology. So as you're traveling around the world, and this is something that I do all the time, I don't have to wonder where I'm connecting. My endpoint agent, my global protect agent connects to wherever it's best in the cloud. And whether it's connecting through a network-based resource or a cloud-based resource, I don't really know. I don't really care because I have the same policy all the time. Now, by extending this to the endpoints, it delivers us this full visibility. It gives us easier management. It unifies policy, and that policy is typically based on the user, so I don't get a different location-based policy. My policy is based on me as a user, and by doing this, we can stop advanced threats, and of course, it can be consumed on-premise or as a cloud-based service. So as we think about what's happening, all organizations now have multiple kinds of endpoints. And these endpoints I'm talking about are user-based endpoints. We can talk later on, if anybody wants, on a different webinar about server-based endpoints, but these are user-based endpoints. So there's a managed endpoint. These are the ones that you control. There's VDI, where you get virtual desktops. That's a different kind of endpoint. It's a way you consume services. And then there's BYOD, home systems, those kinds of things. They're a third type of endpoint. And these are high-level generalizations, but the way we're going to add them to our zero trust environment is first with a managed endpoint, we're going to leverage traps plus our global protect service plus multi-factor authentication. And so now this is kind of what we can really do if we control the endpoint. VDI, that's going to be a little bit different because VDI doesn't need traps because the endpoint itself doesn't ever have the real software. It's a representation being served to it virtually. So we continue to use traps global protect and multi-factor authentication. And then on a BYOD system, if you can add traps to that, that's great. But certainly you want to use global protect, and if you can't install software, you can have a clientless version of global protect available there. Although certainly if the user will allow you, you can deploy traps and global protect and multi-factor authentication and treat it like a managed endpoint. And then all these things connect through your network. They leverage the Global Protect Cloud and all the cloud-based services. We support and protect against advanced malware through Wildfire, which is our sandbox solution. We send all those logs to the cloud through our logging service, and then we use our magnifier tool to do analytics around it, and this is how we integrate these endpoints into the platform in a holistic way. So the platform must follow the data and protect it everywhere it moves, everywhere it's used. And so what you're doing with Zero Trust is you're designing everything from the inside out. So you start with your protect surface, and then around your protect surface you define a micro-perimeter. You enforce the micro-perimeter with a segmentation gateway. That's a next-generation firewall when it's used in a Zero Trust environment. And then your users connect through that on your corporate network. When you move into the cloud, of course, you're going to extend those users through the Global Protect Cloud Service solution, and we're going to then bring them back into the network. And again, for all those environments, we're going to use traps to protect against endpoint exploitation. We're going to use Global Protect to define and enforce access policy as it relates to the protect surface. And then we're going to use our Panorama centralized management solution to provide global policy that is transparently consumed by the user no matter where they move. And then when we look at the type of access control and inspection, that has to happen from layer 2 through layer 7. So there's a thing that we've created called the Kipling method of zero trust rule writing, where we take the the idea of who, what, when, where, why, and how, and that was created by Rudyard Kipling, so it's a little homage to him. Our user ID becomes a who statement, our application ID becomes a how statement, and our content ID, our application ID becomes a what statement, and our content ID becomes a how statement. So by writing rules based upon this, we can go to the cloud or as a cloud service. The who, if in this case to Salesforce, if the user ID is sales, the application ID is Salesforce, then the content ID is salesforce.com, a special content ID on how you're going to use Salesforce, and content ID includes threat protection rules, SSL decryption, URL filtering, wildfire, all those types of things. And we can write a very specific rule based upon the user and the application, and the same thing works for on-premise. Here's one for hospitals using an application called Epic. That's the application ID, the what statement. The user ID is Epic users, doctors, nurses, administrators, and then there's a specific content ID just for that one particular application. So that's how we would write these policies that function layer 2 through 7. Now I want to turn it over to Lieuwe, who, like I said, is a good friend of mine. But most importantly, for me, they've been on this Zero Trust journey with me for many, many years. He hosts an event every year in the Amsterdam region called Bright and Cloudy, which is functionally a Zero Trust conference. And he and I and his co-founder are the only 3 people who've attended every single one of them, and so I'm always honored to go there. And also, they were the Traps Specialized Partner of the Year in 2017, which was a big, big honor for them. And so, Lieuwe, talk to me about what you're doing in the world of Zero Trust and how you actually do this in real life with your clients.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for coming up with this whole Zero Trust concept, because I believe it's really important to actually protect our customers. Protection is key. We don't care for sitting here and watching how customers get breached. Zero Trust actually allows us to write the policy like you defined with the Kipling method. If there's no way for a user to do weird behavior, then why would you let him? That's a fundamental concept. It's the main principles we get from Zero Trust. And that's also how we looked at endpoint protection. You asked me before, how did you get into traps? Well, we come from the world of creating those Zero Trust rules. And we never bothered going too much into this AV space because, well, like I explained before, it's slow and etc. But that's changed because, well, you see here, ransomware came along, and that's a really apparent problem to our customers. And they said, look, our applications are in a great way prevented from breaching, but my endpoints are now being breached all the time, so please help me with that. And the existing ways of doing it just wouldn't help. You see on the right screen the amount of pieces of malware there that need to be protected from, and traditionally you would write a big database of known bads and match against that, and that simply doesn't work. So how would we cope with that? Well, to summarize, this is to me the business value of traps. I'll get into the technical details in a bit, but what this graph shows you, whether it's a small piece of malware which is very specific for you, specifically crafted for you, or whether it's really common, the old stuff that even the AV vendors will catch for you, traps has immediate prevention, and that to me is key, right? Whereas in the red line you see how traditional ways of behavioral analysis and signature-based prevention works. You see the shaded area, the green shaded area. That's what you miss if you don't invest in a solution like this. So we were looking for something, and there's actually 3 different requirements that were most important to us. We need both network inspection, that you've already covered that. We need to see the behavior of an endpoint. It's at least as important to protect an endpoint than having some kind of software installed on the endpoint itself. And of course, we need to see do the typical endpoint stuff, like seeing which files are there, which processes are running, what are they doing. And for example, with ransomware, it became very apparent that we cannot do that on the network. We need to do it on the endpoint. We need to sit on the endpoint. So it needs to be in all those places. So lots of solutions we looked at just wouldn't fit in that area already. Then the next one, it needs to be good. It needs to be properly done, like a next generation firewall that we use with Palo Alto Networks. Proper user ID, decryption, very extensive URL database that prevents us from clicking on malware URLs, for example. And we don't want this signature dependency because it leads to nowhere. It slows our systems down. And speaking of slowing our systems down, the last one, customers really don't like agents, especially if they slow everything down, right? So we need this footprint needs to be very small. Well, to start with the last one, that's really easy because these are the numbers of the Traps agent. It's only 50 megabytes of RAM and really, really low CPU usage. Well, I could talk for days to explain how that works and how clever this team of you guys have done this, but we will not. We don't have all day, right? But I'll show you a bit on what actually won me over for Traps. This is how we do exploits. You have exploits and malware, and exploits is the stuff that tries to break out an existing application. And as we all know, there are bugs. In this example, this is a typical desktop application that reads Adobe PDF files, and there is bugs in the system, in the application, or wherever. And of course, vendors have created patches. Those are the blue ones. So bits of those are patched by patches. So, but not everything. There's always the bugs that we don't know of yet. We call that 0 days, right? So there's always going to be gaps. And what does this malware do? It needs few steps. And that's key. In this case, you see a heave spray, then ROP, and then some system calls. Without getting into those details, you see that an exploit always has a few, 3, 5, 6 steps that it needs in order to become active. So how many of those steps hypothetically are there? Well, there is between 20 and 30, 30 is a bit on the high side. So there's only 20 to 30 types of exploits that malware needs to do, right? So what if we could just simply prevent those? Well, and that's exactly what Traps did. And it looks like this. So if you prevent all those circles, those ways of exploitation, if you can somehow figure some way out to do this very cleverly, you have made sure that this malware cannot do its job. And that's what we want, right? And Traps calls this EPM, exploit prevention modules. And we discover 1, 2 types of exploit techniques per year. So what does that mean? We only need 1 or 2 updates of the software a year. Compare that to any other solution that's out there that needs hundreds of thousands of new signatures per day, right? So that's the difference. The less updates you need, the better. And that's for exploitation. And like you mentioned before, John, there's also other pieces of the puzzle. I suppose this is the example of the crypto locker. I won't dive into it, but you can create a screenshot of this to study it in more detail. After this exploitation, there can be malware delivered, and suppose that happens, or you get malware through another way. In the same clever way, there's all kinds of systems that Traps uses to also prevent the malware spreading and enabling of malicious code. A very important one there is Wildfire that you may have heard of. So we have that covered, right? The malware and exploits, without lots of signatures, we actually have a working product. Very important to me, very important to our customers that it does work actually. And then, well, last one, yeah, about the network. Well, you and I are both Zero Trust guys. We know that everything, it starts on the network. Data in motion, exploitation goes through the network. Infections comes in through the network. Really, really important. Don't forget it. Can't do it on the endpoint. It needs to be somewhere else in the platform. Well, you've shown this picture. If you are in the premises of your organization, then you have the segmentation gateway, next generation firewall to protect you. And if you get outside of that, of course you need the same protection. And Cloud Protect does exactly that. It makes you virtually part of your network again. So you have the same protection as if you were on your own network. And
Well, and this leads to a question that came in about why can't I do, network security functions that we typically think as network security functions, such as URL filtering or IPS, on the endpoint? How come it needs to be involved in the network at all? Why can't it just stand alone?
Yeah, well, it doesn't fit in 50 megabytes of RAM, huh? If you know how much RAM there sits in a next generation firewall, for example. It's just, some vendors try this, huh? And they will end up with a very slow agent. And suppose you have a VDI pool with all VDI desktops. So on the VDI desktop itself, which sits in the data center, there should be all kinds of protection. And if you have an IPS running there and a web filter running there and all kinds of prevention for malicious files in the, running there, all those new features that need to be added all the time because new stuff is discovered, it's simply too big.
Yeah, and history has taught us this. One thing for being fairly old is you see history repeating itself, and we kind of tried this and tried this and tried this, and why we keep coming back to failed models always kind of is a head scratcher for me.
Yeah, that's a very philosophic question. I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that. But yeah, I agree. So this means all of this. I found my solution basically. And now it's a matter of how would you manage this? How would you manage this in a zero trust kind of way, right? And I'll give you a few examples of how we do this, and I'll just show you a few best practices that we practice, just to learn from. Zero trust tells you don't give people access to something that they don't use anyway, right? So by default, on a Windows system, you can just run an executable, start a program from everywhere. And it's a very simple feature, but very important. What you see here on the desktop is an actual screenshot of how you would configure policy in Traps. And what it says here, all these locations, you are simply not allowed to run any program. In the temporary internet files, for example. So typically, what happens, you click on a download. It's a malicious one, and then in the browser click on it again, and it will try to run your executable or your PDF file for you. And that's what you don't want in this case. So that's what we configure here. It's really zero trust. Don't trust what data you're downloading, right? We trust the user, of course. That's a different story. But we don't trust the packet that's going to send out as a result of not blocking this.
Yeah, and there's a question about how restrictive should Traps policies be. And I know you said something to me earlier, which is you try to make it as restrictive as possible because it's easier to make it less restrictive than it is to make it more restrictive in the future.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So it's always easier to ask for forgiveness than for permission. So what we usually do is start out quite strictly, test it in a good way, and then and we call it the PEEP system. If something doesn't work, you will know. But if you forgot to restrict something, you will never know. So why not start with something that's restrictive by default? And by the way, Traps does a good job at that. Huh? So if you look at my next screenshot here, this is actually the default rule that comes with the product when it gets to a certain module that sits in Traps. And what you'll see here is you see that all computers for all the processes enable this particular module. And that's how I like it. It's like the default deny rule in the firewall. Prevents every weird stuff from happening. And if you do that in the real world on a Windows system, or by the way, macOS is also supported, works in a similar way, things will break. And we know all that, and Palo Alto Networks knows that. So we have exceptions that come also with the product, which is part of the updates that you get. Configuration updates, that is. Huh? And this is an example of something that as an exception very specific to a process called sandboxy for Windows, which disables the same module. And this is actually a competitor's AV product that didn't play well with Traps, and Traps actually made it work and make sure that the two, if for whatever reason you want still want a cumbersome AV on your endpoint, this will actually make an exception for it so it will work. And I really like this model, right? From the start, allow nothing, and if it would break something, add it. And these are these are driven by support cases of Palo Alto Networks. Whenever some incompatibility was there, such a rule would be added, and as a result, we have a very, very stable product, which out of the box is already very good. But of course, you'll run into exceptions that you need to make. And John, I don't know about your experience, but this is what we see a lot when it comes to any security policy.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. I love that image. It's so descriptive of what happens, because we tend to be very concerned at the beginning of everything, but as time goes on, and it's true everywhere, right? Firewalls. You put in a new firewall rule, you have a lot of change control, but no one ever asks, you know, is that still a useful rule? Is it causing problems? Is it causing somebody to get in an unrestricted way because we don't use it anymore? Time is your enemy in policy, and I think that's a great image there, Lieuwe.
Yeah, so what do you think happens if we have one of those apples on the right that we have to present to our customer if something went wrong? That's bad news. So you need to come up with a way of working. I think that's true for everybody managing any security product, to make sure that the apple stays fresh, right? And I'll give you the solutions are actually quite simple. I'll give you a simple one in this case. Suppose you have an exception that you need to make. Traps allows you to be very, very specific about this exception. You can restrict it to a certain user, to a group of people, to everything what AD gives you, an organizational unit, for example. Please use this, because that means that for a very specific use case, you create an exception that won't affect all the other users in the same organization. And if you have really a problem that occurs everywhere, you can always make it a bit broader. So this is one way of doing that, making sure that you create a specific rule, and this is what it looks like. It just figures out groups that are in your Active Directory, and you can imagine that there's you also have to do a review of policy. Traps shows you when a policy was created, by whom, and you should regularly revisit those and see if it's still applicable. Also, what we see a lot is what Traps tells you a lot in their logging. Whenever, suppose you have a prevention module that fires, it's really nice because you don't have that problem anymore, but maybe you want to know this, right? And you can install Traps and in a fire and forget way, but that's a pity. And a wise man once told me you should inspect everything and log everything. It's also part of the Zero Trust philosophy. So how do you do this? Because Traps will tell you a lot. It will tell you which user at which moment on which IP address tries to execute a certain executable. It was not allowed by the system. How do you make use of it? It's like this problem. It's a typical SOC problem. How many needles are there? Do I have them all? I'll show you a little bit how we did it, just a glimpse. And that's we basically collect all the log files from Traps, and a very important step that everybody should do, in my belief, is enrich that data. If you know it's from a certain IP address, you want to know whether that's on the internet, whether it's one of the users that are in a group of users, for example, in the board that have access to specific files, because that will bump up the importance of that event, right? You want to correlate this with what you've seen on the network, for example, and if you have all those data about an event that Traps gives you, then you should take a look at them all. And you can never do that by manual labor, right? You should have a system to which you run all those enriched events, and based on logic that you've learned by looking at them, there's actually in the main. If you summarize three things, there's nothing to worry about. Log only, that's the majority of stuff. And you don't want to have a manual person looking at that. And then you have the stuff that, for example, some kind of exploit that is prevented. You want to know which file is this. Did you see it somewhere else? How did it get into the network? Is someone spear phishing us, for example? And that's up for manual analysis. And then an analyst should take a look and investigate what this user has downloaded recently, what kind of mail he had, etc. But if we know all this, yeah.
Yeah, and so just talk, in the enrichment there, you specify some things. Autofocus, for people who aren't familiar, autofocus is our threat hunting tool where you can search logs. But you talk about the next generation firewall logs that are relevant. This enrichment is essentially built into the platform though, right?
Yeah, so lots of it we get from, well, it's a combination of things. Lots of it we get from, for example, autofocus, because whenever we see malware somewhere, Wildfire publishes into autofocus, which is the really big database of everything we know about bad files, bad actors, bad IPs, and it's fed by the specific customer that generated this event, but also by everybody else on the world. So we can learn from each other. That's the intelligence that Palo Alto gives us there. So we query autofocus, and we know what kind of malware we're dealing with. Unit 42 does a fine job of classifying those. We know this is malware which is targeted for the banking industry. Well, you can imagine that if we see banking malware being active on, or active, not active, being prevented to be active, becoming active in a bank, that's a higher priority and should be immediately escalated than if it's a non-banking customer, for example. Right? Yeah. And in some cases, we can also even automatically take action. For example, if we see that a certain user gets attacked a lot and apparently something is wrong with his user account, or he's doing some malicious behavior, and since we are attacked automatically, we also want to respond automatically. And there's actually 2 examples that we can do. And that we do for customers. We shut down a VDI desktop, for example. If we see that a certain device is constantly blocking malware, it's not active, we know, but it's trying to reinfect all the time. Why don't we shut it off, just to prevent any further trouble, and raise a ticket, and so shoot first, ask questions later, basically. Instead of having a manual analysis and a couple of days later calling the system administrators, Luke, could you take a look at the system, and they put it very low on their priority list. We'll do it the other way around. Shut it down and figure out what happened. And we can also block a user in AD, for example, as another remediative action. And to me, this is what everybody should be looking into, because that means that you would turn the knowledge you have gained from your from what you see in the log files into action, basically.
Well, thank you, Lieuwe. We're going to go to some questions, and I'm looking through the list here, and well, I think we've hit most of the answers already. Here we go. So you've talked about performance and how the efficiency of the Traps agent. What about performance and latency of Global Protect and Global Protect Cloud Service? And that's a question that I think is best answered by you as somebody who deals with the end user instead of me as a representative of the company. I'd like to hear how you see it with your customer base.
Yeah, the worry is suppose we tunnel all traffic through a VPN, that would probably hurt me, right? Well, everybody fears this. And in practice, it's actually never a problem, especially since we have this cloud service. So it used to be a problem if you were in China and you want to access China resources for your company or a Chinese website, and then it would go all the way back to the US or to Europe, the traffic, and then back to China again, and that would be really slow. But Palo Alto really solved this by this Global Protect service, which, well, as you explained that you use, you're traveling all around the world, and there's really, yeah, you need to go through the internet anyway to get to your resources. So what you do, the first step is really close, and then the biggest latency is from the first step to the rest, which is comparable to if you would go directly to the resource. So in practice, we don't see this problem at all, especially since we have this Glow Protect as a service.
And then, you know, as the Traps Partner of the Year, and somebody who's really been doing some interesting things in that world, what are your tips, or how would you, other than what you already said, what are some high level, just are there some, man, you should really think of it this way, or you should do that, or here's some things that just people don't usually get. What are the things that really distinguish you guys and made you Traps Partner of the Year?
Yeah, I was not on the committee that decided this, but I think we did a lot of integrations, especially on this logging part. Take the knowledge you have. There's so much security intelligence in all those products of Palo Alto Networks. If you've seen the Epic Cloud event recently, Lee Clarence did a really good job of explaining how security and security intel from the cloud will change the world, and that's difficult for someone from Europe to say, because we have all these privacy laws, right? But my view is, if we don't use all the data we gain from Traps, gain from the next generation firewall, combine that all together and do clever things with it, if we don't do this on a cloud scale somehow, that's actually going to becoming a bigger risk than the risk of the hypothetical risk of getting into the cloud yourself. So if you have these products, make sure you configure them properly, make sure they're strict according to Zero Trust principles, and do something with your logging, please.
There you go. There you go. So great tips from Lieuwe Jan Koning, the CTO of ON2IT, one of the pioneers in deploying Zero Trust networks, and of course a big advocate of the platform story and Traps especially. So thank you for joining me today. I'll look forward to seeing you the next time I'm in the Netherlands. Our contact information is up there on the screen, so let us know if you have any questions. And until next time, thank you for joining us. Go Palo Alto Networks.